right, welcome to the very first episode of Between the Lines, exploring the intersection of local and national issues. Each episode we're going to be focusing on a different subject and bringing on two guests from the community to help discuss it. I'm your host, Eben Diskin, the editor of the Townie, and today we'll be talking about gentrification, something we're pretty familiar with here in Newburyport. What does it mean? How do we know it's happening? How does it impact locals? And what does it mean for the evolution of our community, more specifically? And today we have two pretty brave guests who agreed to join me on this first episode of the show. John Giordano. John is a former Merrimack College professor who served as the board president of Theater in the Open and volunteered on local political campaigns. He started numerous community-based educational access programs in Boston and Philadelphia, focused on college access for first-generation college students, and is the co-founder of Indivisible Rise, a local group focused on strengthening democracy. He's currently a coach helping people move forward in school, career, and life. And sitting next to him is Jim Roy. Jim's an author and historian who's written articles in both academic and popular journals. You might remember his biweekly newsletter, the Newburyport Liberator. He sat on the board of the Newburyport Library renovation committee and spent 30 years as the chair of the mayor's parking and traffic committee, which resulted in the downtown parking garage. And if you've all been enjoying our new waterfront park, that is the direct result of Jim's efforts. He also co-chaired the committee that created Newburyport's only local historic district. Whew, quite the resume, guys. Good to have you guys on. Thanks for being here. Today's episode, as I said, we're going to be talking about Newburyport's cultural evolution, and I don't want to get too hung up on definitions, but rightly or wrongly, when we talk about this issue in Newburyport, we call it gentrification, which by definition means more affluent residents moving into a neighborhood that was previously considered undesirable, and through economic influence and beautification, making it desirable, albeit with the displacement of those who used to live there. Just so we're defining our terms, do you guys take issue with this definition when it comes to Newburyport? And do you think that's what we've been seeing here?
I don't think there's any question. Newburyport is gentrified. I don't have a problem with the definition either. It's a historic fact, and it's been going on for 20 to 30 years. I don't know how much further we can be gentrified. There's a limit to everything. On my own street, when we first came here in the 1980s, there were 15 houses on our street, and I would say 13 of them were lived in by native Newburyporters or long-term residents, and today there are only 2. So that's definitely, a change in the neighborhood, and it's resulted in better housing, in my opinion, and certainly people with higher incomes.
Do you think it's because those people were priced out, the original Newburyporters?
I wouldn't say they were pressed out per se, but you have to understand, with a long-term attitude, that Newburyport's economy had dipped terribly. The mills were gone. The only manufacturing enterprise that I can recall really being in operation was Toll Silver, and they went out. I don't know the exact date of that, but there weren't any jobs, and a couple of people who lived in our street worked at Toll. And a couple of people died, and houses were turned over. But the real spark was the renovation of downtown in the 1970s. That's what started the whole thing. Not in the residential areas, but the downtown.
Right. And John, you've lived here since 2001. So what have you noticed in terms of Newburyport's change in demographics, culture since then?
Yeah, that's right. I moved here actually the week of September 11th,
Interesting
2001. It was a pretty interesting time. I would say your definition of gentrification is pretty accurate, right? Except the early phases of gentrification, which are usually people without a lot of money coming into a place because it's cheap. So you get a lot of artists moving into neighborhoods, making them cool, which catches the attention of developers, who then start investing in that community. Prices go up, people get priced out, and interestingly, often the artists end up getting priced out too, right? But I think in the early phases of gentrification, you actually have artists kind of coexisting with the people who've lived there for a long time, seeing probably because they live with a certain amount of instability. right? They move in to find room, room to have studios, etc. But there's no question that there's a lot said about the fact that artists will start the process of gentrification, which is not necessarily a good thing if you're trying to preserve working class communities. In terms of Newburyport, I came here at a time where it didn't feel quite as the people moving in didn't seem quite as affluent as they do now. I have a bunch. My circle are basically artists and educators. So it's people who could kind of hardly afford to live here, but could get in, I guess you could say, and have, had a more modest sort of experience here than maybe some of the newer families.
You have noticed.
However,
you have noticed a change.
But however,
For sure,
I've noticed a big change, and I'm sure I'm part of that change. I wouldn't try to deny that. I have been part of the gentrification process.
Well, let's talk about those inflection points that you kind of mentioned. The first one being the urban renewal in the 60s and 70s, and what kind of sparked this cultural evolution. So if we kind of accept that the urban renewal and the revitalization of downtown 60s and 70s was the first major inflection point that catalyzed a slow evolution toward what we're seeing right now. But in the last decade, it feels to me, and maybe John, you'll agree with this too, that we're hitting almost a second inflection point with this influx of expensive. Anyone who's walked downtown can see what I'm talking about. The expensive jewelry stores, luxury real estate offices taking over what used to be kind of more affordable storefronts. How do you guys think about that?
Well, I'm going to go back a little further than that, if I may.
Please.
Can we focus in on this?
I can hold this up, yeah.
That's from 1972. That's in Street.
Okay. For those listening on the radio, I'm holding up a picture of In Street from 1972.
So the contrast between that and just...
It's not very nice for those who can't see. Those who can't see the picture.
7 years later was just extraordinary. And I think people have to realize, if they don't have long historical memories here, that the initial idea was to razz all of that, to tear down all of In Street, to tear down all one half of State Street. The whole place was going to be destroyed. And luckily, it was Byron Matthews was the mayor, and Jack Bradshaw was the planning director. And there was a swell of support for opposing this from what I would call the Yankee crust, which no longer exists in Newburyport. That's one of the changes that we'll discuss in the last 10 years. The social hold or grip that the Yankee crust, the Upper Ridge High Street crowd, the historical society crowd, has disappeared. But then it had some oomph to it and some influence over Byron Matthews, who was a mayor for 10 years, and a Greek immigrant family. But he was a smart guy, and they convinced him that this is not the way to rehabilitate Newburyport. So we got the downtown squared away, and that's when I moved in, when that had been done. But the neighborhoods were really sketchy, really sketchy. My street, only 1 block from State Street. As I say, it was working class. And I kind of agree that the first couple of people that started moving into Fruit Street, like myself and my wife, I'm a writer, she was an artist, we did almost all the work ourselves that we were qualified to do. And a lot of the people on the street were that way. They were upper, lower income, or was it the other way around? But, didn't have much money or anything like that. But boy, you saw, talk about gentrification. Real estate values really start to jump, and it wasn't slow. It was very, very fast. Newburyport had no more mills. We had lost our commuter rail to Boston in 1976. Very isolated, but the lure of the downtown was enough to draw people in who liked lower prices, historic houses, and the local working class people with no job prospects, they couldn't compete with that. And that's how it all started. Now, I agree, the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a change to that. I mean, I've never seen such flamboyant wealth in this town, and it is that. I mean, number one Fruit Street is on the market for about close to $2 million. I mean, I can hardly cope with that price.
Yeah.
Can't even comprehend it.
Yeah. I think there's a trend of, when I was growing up, I would hear people who were longtime Newburyporters complain that the town's not like it was when I grew up here. You know, I don't recognize the businesses. I can't afford the restaurants. The people are all different. They're all yuppies from Boston, and now they're, you know, taking over our town. And I always kind of thought, okay, these older people who are, you know, they just like to gripe and complain, and they're just nostalgic for, you know, a period that probably was never as nice as they thought it was. And now that I am, you know, getting a little older, I feel like I'm becoming one of those people. And I look around and I'm thinking, like, okay, when I grew up here in the 90s and early 2000s, the things were affordable. I could get a burger for like $9, and, you know, a pizza for $10, and the houses were, you know, I could conceive of myself growing up and affording to buy a house in this town. And now I just don't see that. And I think a lot of people my age, in their mid-30s, are similarly frustrated, you know, wanting to live in the town that they grew up in, and they can't.
But on the other hand, the school is much better.
Exactly.
Your kid's going to get a much better education than he was going to get 15 or 20 years ago, that's for sure. City services are much better. With growing affluence, you get a bigger tax base. The city has more money to spend to make it a better place. And so, you know, there's that balance.
Yeah, yeah. And I think people have a tendency to long for the town they grew up in, regardless of whether or not that town was actually, in reality, a nicer place than it is now. But, you know, we showed that picture of In Street earlier. I think a lot of people, if you ask them, would you want to go back to the 70s, Newburyport, they would kind of blindly say yes, that they would, despite the fact that so many, you know, infrastructural improvements and educational improvements have been made since then. But I think there's this knee-jerk reaction to change that is negative, and regardless of whether that change in culture is objectively positive or not, I think people always want to go back to the way it was. How do you guys think about?
Well, I'd like
that?
your opinion. My opinion is I don't know anybody, and I've lived here I don't know anybody who wants to go back to the 70s.
Good.
How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tricky, right? Because the nostalgia is powerful, and you often perhaps edit the past and pull out the things about it that you like the most. So maybe there was something cultural about Newburyport that people want, but I can't imagine many people would say they want it to be economically the way it was then.
Yeah,
right?
I think economic.
Because you had, like in the 1930s, right, and 40s, over 65% of Newburyporters were blue collar manufacturing job workers, right? You know, there were people working in factories, or that those factories had been closing, and they were, you know, those were their skills, and they did, you know, there wasn't enough work, right? Now I think we're at a point where like 91% of people live in Newburyport are white collar workers, right? So what about, where are those blue collar workers? What are they doing now? Are they still here? And along with that, you know, the economics, what has happened to their culture, the bowling alleys and the clubs. You and I have talked about
that, yeah.
Lloyd Warner's Yankee City, right? Anthropology/sociology study throughout the 1930s, which yielded so much really important information about this city that has significance on the national level, right? Where people had this idea that, you know, the United States was really egalitarian and people can move in terms of classes. That class of, right, the sort of the town, I don't know, what did you call them? The sort of the upper
Yankee
crust?
crust.
Oh,
The Yankee crust.
crust, yeah.
Right, I mean, that was a very immovable social structure. It wasn't even based so much on money. A lot of their money had passed, but they had the social status that kept them kind of as this sort of upper class in this town.
Yeah.
Now you could say that's what prevented Newburyport's downtown from being raised and turned into a shopping center, which I think everybody agrees would have been a disaster. However, what it really did was it reestablished the community for that upper class. It took another 50 years for it to happen. But, you know, it might not be the sort of the old money, it's new money, it's there's more there's more social movement, but the truth is, that won. That right, their ideas won. So what does that mean in terms of the overall culture of the community?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that, in terms of longing for the past economically and infrastructurally, I think everyone's very happy with where we're at today. But I think culturally is what I want to hone in on, and that's where I think there's a little bit of a disconnect. And I want to talk more about the clubs that you briefly mentioned, because I think that's important, and it's interesting when we talk about culture and the way we evaluate Newburyport's culture right now and even relate to each other within it. So if you want to, can you go a little deeper into the Yankee City study and just talk about how those third spaces were so important for building community?
Yeah, so one of the things that study did was really lay out, really kind of almost classify all these different clubs that people were involved with, whether it be formal churches or community service organizations, social clubs. There were hundreds and hundreds of these clubs across all the different classes, the 6 classes that they identified in Newburyport. And what, somebody like Robert Putnam's work in social capital, he wrote that great book, Bowling Alone, like what happened by the 1990s, that people were really retreating, kind of leaving their front porches, going inside, watching TV, stopped going to going to their bowling leagues or whatever it was, stopped doing volunteer work, and kind of became very individualistic and internalized, and how that's really damages society. Mm-hmm. So a lot of Newburyport's vibrancy was in these clubs because there was so much social capital being exchanged across these different clubs, and there was a club for every type of person from every sort of socioeconomic group. We've really lost that, and I think if there's a revitalization that needs to happen in this community, we need to bring back these organizations. Sure, there are people who volunteer, there are people who are in their social clubs, there are book clubs and all that, but we could do more to really make this more formal and recognize the value that it has to both build culture, but also revitalize a community or invigorate a community economically across all the sort of classes of people who live here, the economic classes.
I think society has changed too radically for that to ever happen. I think the power of television, the power of the phones and stuff, the attentions of the kids who are almost impossible to reach. Mm-hmm. That's my feeling when I encounter them. I mean, just we're in 2 different realms. And I think it's nostalgia to think you can recreate what you're just describing. I don't see that happening at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at,
I'm going to disagree a little,
Okay.
Only to the extent that, there's a part of me that recognizes that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a realist. However, I can tell you, my son just found our old film cameras, and he's going to go.
That's embarrassing.
He's going to go shoot 35 millimeter, film.
Yeah, great.
And I do think that even with young people, they know what this. Like, there was just a study in Britain that said that over half of teens wish there was no internet. Like, they sort of know what this technology is doing to them. Mm-hmm. They might not be able to say, let's start this thing. They don't have the resources to do it, but we can put the ideas out there that there's ways to build a community that are not grounded in technology. So, sometimes you just have to do the legwork to get something like this moving.
Yeah.
I'm pretty optimistic that we can reestablish people being together in real time, working on things that they care about. It happens all the time here, but it probably doesn't happen enough.
Seems like there could be a reverse pendulum swing at some point, once people are so inundated with social media and AI that kids will start to long for almost a simpler.
Well, parents are also mandating it, right? All those lawn signs
Sure.
all over Newburyport about heads up is all about getting kids' noses out of technology.
Yeah.
And if parents start doing that when they're quite young, I mean, we have a generation of young people that have been really hard hit by it. Mm-hmm. But maybe these really young kids won't ever quite get there if the parents raise them a different way.
I think the only unifying thing going on in town are the sports leagues and stuff like that, which are very, very well organized and well attended, and everyone's involved. Mm-hmm. And from the very youngest age, up to high school, I think that is definitely a bonding thing. Mm-hmm. But I'm struck, for example, like Yankee homecoming. That used to be such a big deal. and it was a unifying thing. I mean, there were floats and everyone working together. That's all really
It's
faded
gotten a little
away.
predictable.
Yeah.
Well, but people like predictable things oftentimes. Tradition.
You think?
Yeah, tradition.
You think you think locals have soured
Oh,
on
yeah.
it? You
Oh, yeah.
think people aren't visiting as much as they used to? Where do you think that is behind that? What do you think is
Follow
behind the people souring on Yankee Homecoming? Why isn't it as unifying as it
I think
used to be?
the changing demographic
Demographics,
of the
because they're not
town.
from here, they don't understand the tradition, they're not as connected
Right,
to it. Okay.
and that was a working class thing. I mean, you can just watch the vendors who come to Yankee Homecoming, with all that tacky stuff that no one's buying. I mean, I don't think some of these tech people who live on High Street, they don't care about Yankee Homecoming, and
Yeah, that is kind of the interesting paradox of gentrification is people move here for the arts and the tradition and the history, but then those people who move here, they don't have the same connection to the town, and then those things slowly erode until it's not there anymore, and
Yeah,
the things
I mean-
they moved here for in the first place aren't there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think really what it sort of opens up the question of how much are people willing to roll up their sleeves for their community, right? I think I've been involved in community-based programming for a long time. That's really the center of what I do, and I think when you're always thinking about how to build community, you have to always think about the work people are inspired to do, not just the willingness to do it, but the desire to do it. And I wonder if what's happening in Newburyport over time is that people who came here, say, in the 80s, right, like you did, Jim, were you sort of like, hey, I'm not going to just roll up my sleeve and work on my house, work on the aspects of fixing this house up that I can, but I'm also going to I'm going to be a steward of my community. And maybe what happens with more and more sort of money, there's more distance, and people start thinking, well, I pay for those services. I don't have to roll up my sleeves. But what does it
People
mean
provide them to them.
to
They don't
them.
have to work to make it happen
Right.
themselves. Or
What does it mean to
contribute.
volunteer and to learn, to listen at what the problems are, what the challenges are, what the needs are, and be willing to roll up your sleeves and donate your time, right, to making a better community?
Well, look at the poor voter turnout. For instance, for the rec center thing. I mean, I couldn't believe that. That was a hot topic around town, but only 4,000 people bothered to vote. I found that shocking. And
Do we have the number of eligible voters in town? Do you happen to
yeah, it's 10 or something,
10,000? Okay.
I think. Don't
Yeah.
hold me to it. But
Almost true for almost every referendum, but exceedingly bad for this one,
Yeah.
considering how much people.
And
are
it was
talking
all
about it.
over the place.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Now, in the old days, that rec center thing, that wouldn't have gotten anywhere. Anywhere. No one would have voted for that. That shows you the change. I mean, we're becoming more like Brookline and Dedham and Newton and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Where they say, hey, whatever's good for my kid, that's what I want.
I think that's
Which
a
is
good,
not a bad thing
No,
when it
no,
comes to
no,
education. That's what you were saying before. It's always a double-edged sword. I know I was one of the volunteers who worked pretty extensively on the Port Pride project to renovate the Knock and build the new Brez and bundled the senior center in there because the logic was these school projects are not going to pass unless the senior center is included. I would say we've reached another place now where they didn't need to bundle something with the rec center to get people across all demographics, because the big concern is, will the seniors support this kind of thing, right? And actually, it's interesting because I know they didn't even target. I know on the last days of canvassing, they didn't even really target people over 60, right? They were going to really go for the people who will show up are the parents who want this. I think that was a mistake. I think they should have also said, hey, are you willing to invest, pay it forward the way people paid it forward for your kids, But I do think it is another inflection point in terms of, even though we have our numbers of kids in the schools are declining with demographics, we're investing more and more in education. That's a good thing. However, I always look at what's being lost too, right? Are there other services, or is there culture being lost here as a result of that we want to maybe pay attention to?
we're never going to get the past culture of Newburyport back here.
I don't think it's a past culture. It's
Yeah.
never. I'm just not that smitten with nostalgia. But it's almost like where you can draw from the past and bring it forward into the present.
I think it's important. This is the crux of this conversation is really, all this talk about Newburyport culture and do we still have it and how has it changed? What is Newburyport culture? And it's obviously different now than it was in the 80s, than it was in the early 2000s. But to you guys anyway, and your answers might be different, is Newburyport culture? What defines Newburyport as unique compared to other similar seaport towns? We talk about the change from the kind of blue collar demographic and even aesthetic, a more bohemian kind of like artsy scene compared to what we might have now. What is it that defines Newburyport that we're so afraid of losing or that we already have lost?
I would say already have lost.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're a homogeneous, rather like Ipswich, Marblehead, any of these towns. I don't see anything particularly unique about.
It's all over. We're past the point of
Well,
no
no, I
return.
didn't say it was all over. I mean, I love Newburyport. I love being here, but I don't see. I don't think see
no, and
anything
you might
that's
be right.
unique about us at all. No, I really don't.
I think when we moved here in the early 2000s, it felt sort of like to me that it still had a kind of laid backness. It wasn't pretentious. It wasn't a social climbing town where people were putting their wealth on display. That it was laid back and a little creative, and I just felt you didn't have to worry about posturing here. I don't think that's true anymore. When I look at my neighbors, right, like my street has turned over like a lot. There were a lot of old timers. We were one of two young families on the street. Now we're kind of heading to the other end of the scale, and there's younger families moving in. One family, I would say, is very much like us, and the other ones feel like these guys are, finance guys. They're, it's just a different class and a different vibe. And they're fine people. There's no issue there. But I don't think they were looking for a laid back creative and, I don't know, maybe they were.
Did you go in the garden tour this weekend?
I did not.
Wow. There is some
Lots
big
of
time money in this town.
Big money in plants these days.
No, pools.
Oh, and pools. Yeah. You know what was I think a significant moment if we're kind of talking about inflection points. I think actually the referendum to ban cannabis shops in Newburyport was significant because when I really looked at the people who were against that, some of them I know them personally as very staunch libertarians, except their libertarianism only goes as far as the issues that they care about. Some of them are just avowed weed smokers, yet they were sort of like, well, it's an image problem for the town. They're happy to go buy their weed in the next town that's kind of known for being a little rougher around the edges. I found that to be very hypocritical, but it did sort of say, this suggests we're a certain kind of community now.
Yeah, I think piece by piece, people are unknowingly legislating themselves out of having a culture, and with things like that. And it's tough to me. And we might have talked about this a little bit. To me, Newburyport culture, if I had to pick something, and I agree with everything you guys have been saying, is the quirkiness, the things that don't quite belong together, and that's what I'm afraid of losing, and that I think we have lost. Recently,
Can you show me an example of that? Because I don't really.
Like a Fowles, right?
Oh, Fowles,
you have a store
A great
that
loss.
right, and you got like a diner and a magazine shop and a cigar store. All these kind of these disparate things that don't quite fit together, all being sold at once. Denise's flower shop, I always thought was like this, though people don't talk about it as much.
No,
socks and flowers.
You don't think of socks and flowers?
Socks
at
and
the
flowers.
Same time?
You're gonna go buy your socks. You want some flowers, right? I mean, it's like
They go
the two
together.
hand in hand. When I think socks,
More
I
than
think
once
flowers.
I picked up socks when I was buying flowers.
Yeah, and I think it's sad that I didn't go there that much, so I'm as guilty as anyone of maybe not keeping them in business. But the Pink House, everyone knows about. That I think was probably like the best example of this.
Yeah, that was
Because-
quirky. I'll give it
Because
that
it's
much.
it's an objectively unattractive house. Like ask
okay.
any architect, it's an ugly house.
Yeah.
It probably has no historic or architectural aesthetic value, but it was this ugly house sitting in this long marsh alone against this beautiful backdrop, and that ugliness, that sense of out of placeness made it beautiful, and that's why people would paint it. And now, for God knows what reason, it's gone, and they put like an owl platform in its place. So does that make more sense for the fish?
That's a very good point.
Yeah, for the fish and wildlife mission to have like a platform for owl observation, sure. But we are now deprived of this supremely quirky like icon of our community, and the more of that happens, the more I think we lose what I think is our real culture, which is the quirkiness. And you could probably find stuff like this in any town, but because I live here, this is what I see and pay attention to.
I can't help but that reminds me back at the customs house. When I first came here, there was a submarine on the back lawn. And when you needed oil for an oil change, you'd go there, and the guy around the place, he'd go out with a quart can, and he'd take some oil out of the submarine, and here's your quart of oil.
Great story.
I mean, hey man, that's all gone.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
I'd love to see it still there.
Yeah. So that's to me what I worry about. And I'm sure there's other examples that I haven't. I could think of. I won't go into this, but I could name like individuals, people I see around town
sure.
that are, whether they're troubadours or people at the bars, and they're to me local staples that I know I'm going to walk down the street and I'm going to see them, and they have their own interesting past and their story. But I think just like everyone else, as things get more expensive, as the town, continues to evolve, I think these people might slowly start disappearing as well. So,
Well, first of all, they're going to die.
well, sure,
'Cause we're all dying.
but new people are
Who are the new?
new people are less likely to come and replace them because of the way the character of the town is changing.
But we see this kind of homogenization on a national level too.
Yes,
I mean, you go
agreed,
into
yeah.
towns and you see your Starbucks and you see your, this chain and that chain. And Newburyport has resisted chains to some extent. I know there was a lot of people really didn't want Orange Leaf when it was here.
Yeah.
Just like no chains, no chains. So there's still something left.
Yeah.
I think the market basket, the customer strike was one of the most interesting things. Now I know it was all of Market Basket. It was not Newburyport alone. But Newburyport had to buy into it, right? And I saw one car in that parking lot the whole time during the strike. I mean,
I remember that, yeah.
I think that was a real that really suggests there's a lot of people paying attention to labor and loyalty. Now, again, I realize that that went way beyond our community, but our community was right there. And I was proud of that. I was proud of who we were.
Yeah, I remember thinking this is going to make a difference, and then it made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And Shaw's remembers it fondly, I'm sure. The probably best week in their history.
I'll tell you what I was proud of in this town. One of the more proud of things, and that was taking in those two Afghan families, the two churches did, and working out to, provide them with homes. First of all, in the basement of the churches. I mean, a lot of money was spent on plumbing there. A good friend of mine was working on that, and that was community bonding because people were really upset at what these people were going through.
Yeah, and that's, as John said, we're talking about on a national level. People are always, resistant to change, which is a good segue into what I want to talk about. But the Afghan family thing is interesting because a woman who was working with that family wrote an article for me in the Townie about the family and about their progress and how long they've been here and their educational aspirations and everything. And I was nervous about posting it because you invite hate when you post online, and I didn't want to get them. I didn't want to attract any negative attention to this family who, just minding their own business. And I was so pleasantly surprised by the reaction. Everyone on, when I post to promote things on Facebook, on Nextdoor, you get a ton of crazy people who say all kinds of, they find the negative in everything. All positive, unanimously. This is great. We didn't even know this family was here. How can I help? People email me. How can I help support them? And I was redirecting their email to the woman, and it was great. And that was really refreshing to me to see the community very unanimously coming together.
And it wasn't. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that it's the how can I help part that where people often have good intentions and they want to help, but I think what makes a place, a great community, is following through with that. And I had the same sentiment about it. I was very excited to know that they were here. A good friend of mine who was not the person who wrote the article, but who has been tirelessly supporting one of those two families. I reached out to her, and it turns out I started doing pro bono tutoring with one of the high school students in preparation for the possibility of going to college, right? So, I mean, that's something I can do. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here like you should do what I do, but ask yourself what you can do to help people who are vulnerable. There are vulnerable people in our community, and while the people living below the poverty line is only about 5%, that's still 5% of our community. Who are they? And they should be as much in our minds as other people. Or if somebody has refugee status, right, that's a vulnerability, that's a marginalization. That's why I think the Human Rights Commission is an important part of the community. In terms of paying attention, keeping an eye on whether we're a just community or not, because that's part of our strength.
What I liked about the Afghan thing was I didn't see any difference between Republicans and Democrats on that. It was really a non-political thing. People open up their hearts to them, wanted to help, and did. And you'd find the same thing at the food kitchen over there in Salisbury. You're right, 4 or 5%, but those 5% people are still pretty hungry. And I don't see politics involved in that, which I think is great.
Yeah. Well.
And a Newburyport trait.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, no, that was a great community. It's nice to see everyone as a community coming together and agreeing on something. It doesn't happen often.
If newcomers in Newburyport are less inclined to invest in the community, I still think they can be encouraged to join that culture.
Yeah, and I think part of what attracts people, hopefully, to live here is visiting and seeing that culture. And people have told me that, who have moved here recently, that they've moved here and they say everyone's very open and inclusive and friendly, and that's what made them want to live here, which I think is the best way to continue that kind of tradition. And as we kind of get towards closing out here, I do want to talk a little bit about what's happening nationally as far as people's attitude toward change. And it's almost, you could call it reverse gentrification, as we've talked about before. Communities becoming more diverse, maybe, but in the same way, not resembling the same town or community that people grew up with. And that resistance to change, that negative reaction to change, is a lot of what played a big part in the most recent presidential election. The reactions to the changing country, and their neighbors look different. They can't afford their homes or groceries. People blame different things. They blame immigrants. They blame wealthy white people who are moving into their neighborhoods. Whatever it is, it's this deeply rooted nostalgia for the way things were, and a frustration that it's not like that anymore. So how do you guys think about this problem, given the conversation we just had about Newburyport?
I don't see it in Newburyport. I really don't see it. Maybe my circle of friends is not wide enough, but I don't see that resentment here. I don't see
about change. You don't think people are?
No, I don't. I know. I mean, I read the papers too. I mean, I know one source of strength for the current president is this deep dissatisfaction, and dislike of immigrants and all that kind of thing. I just don't sense that here. I really don't, which I think is great. I mean, personally.
Yeah, well, and I think here it's people. When I say resentment, I mean people like my age. I can speak for. It's the only group I can speak for. Is resenting the super wealthy people who moved in and driving up housing prices, and we now can't afford to live here.
That's a fact of life.
And I think that's right. And I think it's different than what we're talking about nationally, where it's almost the opposite. People who grew up in a city that is now more diverse, and maybe certain neighborhoods have gotten less nice, more dangerous, rising prices in grocery stores, whatever. And like I said, you can blame here. We might blame the wealthy people moving in. In another town, they might blame immigrants moving in, and whether those are legitimate kind of.
Well, how diverse do you think
or not.
How diverse do you think we are? I don't see any black people.
Oh, I don't think Newburyport is not diverse at all. I think that's what I'm saying. I think it's a bit of a reverse kind of situation in Newburyport than maybe you see in places nationally. That is like the issue that Trump is kind of seized on, that your country is being taken away from you. So I think it's almost a reverse here, but it's the same sentiment of a resistance to change. The community I'm familiar with, the people that I'm familiar with, whether it's a blue collar culture dissolving in favor of a more upper crust culture, it's the same trend of the culture I'm used to, the community I'm used to, not being the same as it was when I grew up, and I think just having an inherent resentment.
Look, we
of that.
have very big economic problems in the sense that, for example, I actually don't agree that it's just a fact of life about a young person owning a house. I know that when we bought our first house in 1995, our house cost us 3 times our yearly income. Now it's 7-10 times, and you're paying a mortgage for 30 years. You're paying a mortgage on $600-700, $100,000 if you're trying to buy into a community like Newburyport with a $100,000 down payment or something like that. So this is different. The conditions are different. Every generation is getting a smaller piece of the pie economically, and there's less job security. There's no question we're really selling out our younger generations. So I think it's fair that your generation feels slighted. It's the resentments that are manufactured, right? Like the immigrant is responsible for this, and this ill, when there's just no data saying that. Now, look, that's not. There's no question that immigrants will work for less money, but there's also a lot of evidence that they're doing jobs that other people don't necessarily want to do. They're not going after, right? So I just would say let's be really thoughtful about, if we're going to break down, really look carefully, be analytical about what is really a real gripe that deserves resentment and what doesn't.
Right.
We're kind of like, we have politics today that are just really acculturating this culture of resentment, like as if it's a zero-sum game. This person's gain, right, affects you. I was a college professor for many years, and I've heard people say, well, women are just getting all this, they're getting so much more at the expense of the white kids or something, or the white boys. Right. And it's just like there's no evidence for that. If girls were young women were achieving more, they were working harder for it. I saw it. I have the evidence of that experience. So let's just be honest about it. And I agree with Jim that I don't think we see it in Newburyport, because I think people are mostly are inclusive, and they think they're thoughtful. They want to break the issues down. They look at things as they are.
Yeah.
There's always the contingency. They're on Facebook.
Sure.
And they're not. They don't think through things very critically.
Right.
Well, one thing's for sure is this program continues. You've got to do something on housing. I mean, my kids couldn't afford a house here. Just impossible.
I think that's a big driver of the resentment. I mainly speak to my own age group, so maybe I'm in a bubble there. But I think everyone wants someone to blame for their issues, the way they see their town changing. And I think for my generation, it's, all these rich people are moving into my town, and when I was growing up, things could have been affordable. Maybe that's completely wrong. Who knows? Maybe they wouldn't have been affordable anyway, even if we hadn't had this most recent inflection point. But they see all these houses that when they grew up, they were, 300, 400, 500K, and now they're 1.3 million. And that is not a reasonable jump in 7 years. So I think people see that and they're like, who do I blame? I blame all these people moving in from out of town and with their finance jobs, and they're taking our housing. And I think, when we talk about a national level, I think they can blame immigrants. They can blame whoever they want to blame. And it doesn't mean that those are rational scapegoats. But I think everyone wants a scapegoat, and they take.
I hope not everyone.
Change. Yeah, right. I am analyzing the entire human condition.
Yeah, but we can be creative about this too.
Yeah.
For example, I wrote that piece for the Townie that said, we could develop kind of an in the same way there's over 55 communities, and there's, subsidized housing, where you can buy a house at a subsidized rate. We could have like an under 35 community, which I'd like to pair up with a senior community, in the sense that they barter services for each other and help so that the seniors or the grandparent generation are helping the young people learn how to be adults, and the young people are helping grandparents as they age, where they could be in exchange with each other, each paying less than they would normally pay for a particular house or apartment or condo. They would age out, right? And they could build equity in a place. I just think it's a possibility. I don't know a lot about these things, but
I think we just solved the housing problem in Newburyport.
I think
right
if we
here.
don't think creatively about it,
5
This
minutes.
is
That was
utopia,
easy.
okay.
it is utopian. But I mean, we can always modify it back
True.
to something realistic.
And there are other communities that do this?
You know, I mean, there's co-housing, there's different models, but I've never heard of this combination of youth and seniors being sort of paired in a barter basis. Now, sure, it's utopian, but you start with utopia and then you scale back to something that's you can actually make happen.
All right. I think we've covered everything that we can. We've solved Newburyport's cultural issues. I think we solved the housing crisis. We're good. Yeah, really appreciate you guys. Yeah, really appreciate you guys coming on. And thank you to everyone for listening to the first episode of Between the Lines. I would want to thank our guests, Jim, Roy, and John Giordano, for being on the inaugural episode, and also Sarah Hayden from the NCM Studios, and our producer, Mae Power. We'll catch everyone next month.